Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to 2026 Diplomat Diaries, the first edition this January. And we are very fortunate and lucky to have Her Excellency Lindy Cameron, the British High Commissioner to India, with us this afternoon. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us for our first edition of this year. As you know, most of you who have attended such sessions, this is an interactive session with the diplomat of the month, where we invite you to exchange ideas and hear from the diplomat concerned about the country's view of the world. It is a fast-changing world, and it has been fascinating to hear how different capitals in different parts of the world are looking at this changing dynamic, how they are assessing it, both in terms of their foreign policies, but also in terms of how India and that particular country's relations evolve. So in this context, today we'll be talking about Britain, a long-standing partner of India for good reasons. And this relationship has grown dramatically, dynamically in the last year itself with the signing of the CETA, the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. We will hear from the ambassador, from the High Commissioner, as to where this relationship is going with the plans that she and her administration has for India. But I think this is also a moment to reflect on what is happening broadly, geopolitically. I'm sure we live in an age, we all are experiencing that every day and every hour, perhaps. The scale and scope of change is so fast that at times it's very difficult to manage and analyze and comprehend it. But we have with us a practitioner who has to respond to this on a daily basis. She, of course, before being here in India, she was the CEO of the National Cyber Security Division in the UK, and she has held many positions across FCO, DFID, MOD, and the Cabinet Office. So there is a vast wealth of experience here for us to enrich ourselves this afternoon. Ma'am, may I please invite you?
Thank you very much indeed, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I thought it was a good way to start 2026, to get in ahead of any of the other trade deals that might be signed this year, and just remind you what an amazing year the UK and India had in 2025. I was fortunate enough to have a nice long Christmas holiday in Japan, in fact, which was wonderful, which was a real antidote to what had been an extraordinary rollercoaster of a year in 2025 for us when I look back at it. With the trade deal, with Prime Minister Modi's visit to the UK, to Chequers, to sign the deal, and then Prime Minister Starmer's visit back here with a huge business delegation. So it was nice to have a bit of a break, and of course with a couple of sad incidents last year with the Air India crash as well. So good to have a break, but really looking forward to 2026, when I think we can get on with delivering the real promise of that trade deal and that future modern partnership that we want with India. But of course, we are living in a very volatile world. So as my Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has said on many occasions, we have to engage with the world as it is, not the world as we would like it to be. And I think that really defines the calmness and pragmatism that he has brought to the leadership of the United Kingdom. I'm really lucky because he has prioritised the relationship between the UK and India, with that Vision 2035 that the two Prime Ministers signed, in addition to the trade deal. And indeed, I'll come back to that later. But first of all, I just wanted to set out the UK's views on some of the biggest challenges of our time, and some of the challenges that I face as a diplomat and that my colleagues face around the world. I think the primary guiding principle for us is that a retreat into isolationism won't help any country deal with the challenges of a fractured world. We believe that it is only through international cooperation and through the power of joint action that we will succeed, and particularly true in that more volatile world. Next month, we'll mark 4 years since Russia's full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine. And even after 1 million Russian casualties and an ailing economy, Russia is still refusing to pursue peace. It has recently launched some of the largest attacks in Europe since the Second World War, and you will have seen in the last couple of days the pictures of people freezing in Kiev. UK support for Ukraine remains ironclad. We're certain that Ukraine's future must be determined fundamentally by Ukraine, a sovereign nation. And if President Putin is serious about peace, he must stop the killing, end the bloody campaign, and seriously engage with the peace deal that is now on the table. Because I think we all share a desire to bring this war to an end. And India is a really important partner and a really important voice in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Of course, approaching this with respect for India's view is one of the many things that we're able to discuss in that new and deeper partnership. Many of you will also have seen on China the debate in the UK around a new Chinese embassy in London. And I think that is in many ways a sort of small tactical point that illustrates the much wider point that China really matters in the world. And I think there's nobody I need to preach that to here in India, in a sense. Our Prime Minister has said repeatedly that the rise of China is probably the most consequential development in the world today. It is in our national interest to be realistic about the importance of that relationship for our economy, for the world's climate, and for all of our security. We can't just stand back and pretend it's not happening or it's not true. Therefore, much like India, we're taking a very pragmatic approach to that. And our decision to allow the embassy to be built in London allows the UK to follow up on that important economic opportunity, which brings jobs and growth to our country, but will also let us challenge China more effectively when it comes to protecting our security. We then come to some of the more interesting challenges at the moment. If I look towards the Western side then, as Prime Minister Starmer said this week, even as events move fast, what matters most is being clear about the values and the interests that guide us. The United Kingdom has a long history, and our values are not improvised. They were built patiently over time. He's made clear that the UK and the US are close allies and close partners, and that our relationship matters profoundly, and that under President Trump, as with every previous president, we're determined to keep that relationship strong, keep it constructive, and keep it focused on results. But we're also clear right now that any decision, for example, about the future status of Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland and the Kingdom of Denmark, and to them alone, and that right is fundamental, and that we will support it. And I think we've seen the debate about that in the last few days. Of course, these are not the only big foreign policy issues. I've spent much of my career working in humanitarian crises and in conflict. And I sometimes worry that it's too easy to overlook some of the challenges in which the poor and voiceless suffer most. So in crises around the world, from Gaza to Sudan, the UK is doing what responsible powers need to do: defending humanitarian principles, pushing relentlessly for ceasefires, mobilizing aid, and using diplomacy as a tool to save lives. So it's been devastating, really devastating for somebody like me who's worked in the region for a long time, to see the unimaginable suffering of the civilian population in Gaza, and also the years of torment for Israeli hostages and their families following the horrific attacks by Hamas terrorists. The international community united to support that ceasefire arrangement, and we need to continue working together to advance every part of President Trump's 20-point plan and to turn that ceasefire into a lasting peace. But then turning to one of the even more forgotten conflicts, I think. If I look at Sudan, the worst humanitarian crisis of the 21st century unfolding, with over 30 million people needing life-saving aid, famine spreading, cholera and preventable disease rampant. And there the UK is using every lever at our disposal to urgently end that conflict and to get aid into Sudan, including our recent resolution in the Human Rights Council. Therefore, in some ways, it's a bit of a relief to be the High Commissioner, I have to say, here in India, because this is where I get to talk about the upbeat opportunities in the world at the moment. And I think that we have a phenomenal opportunity here. Speaking to you as a British diplomat just a few days away from India's 77th Republic Day, and I think I've probably been given more copies of the Indian Constitution than any other book I've been given in my time in India, including one extremely large-sized one that sits in front of me in every meeting I have. There's perhaps no better place to speak about the kind of mature alliances that my Prime Minister recently spoke about. He said mature alliances are not about pretending differences don't exist. They're about addressing them directly, respectfully, and with a focus on results. And that's very much what we've been trying to do in the last year with India. We are very conscious, I am very conscious of our history with India, but my job is to focus on a modern, future-facing, focused partnership that allows us to get the best out of the extraordinary potential that I see in here in India. This is a country of 1.46 billion people, growing at almost 8% a year in the last quarter. I spend a huge amount of my time reminding many of my colleagues around the world of the huge scale, not only of India now, but of India in the future, and of India's economy in the future. The way that as India grows to become the third largest economy in the world by the end of this decade, that it will be absolutely vital for us to understand how we plan to grow with India and how we plan to link even more closely to that amazing and growing economy. But that kind of future-facing partnership allows us to have difficult but frank conversations on some of the more challenging issues that we face, whether that's immigration fraud or whether that's pro-Palestine extremism, issues where we work extremely closely together with the government of India. Of course, no form of extremism is acceptable in the UK. We take the duty of His Majesty's government to disrupt and counter violent, divisive ideologies wherever they may be, extremely seriously. And we also listen very hard to our partners' concerns as well and take them seriously. But I'm really grateful our partnership is an absolute all-time high, and shepherded by the really clear vision of both Prime Ministers, both of whom I think came back into office in Prime Minister Modi's sense and came into office, Prime Minister Starmer, really determined to take the UK-India relationship to a different level. We saw that with the trade deal, which we delivered fast and pragmatically. We saw that with Vision 2035, that lays out the flagships where we want to really make a difference in this relationship, whether it's in growth, in climate, in defence and security, in technology and innovation, or in education, where there are 9 British universities already planning to set up in India, 6 under the new education policy and 3 in Gift City, wanting to bring some of the best of British education here to India, partly because of the amazing students that they've experienced from India in the universities in the UK, and they see huge opportunity for a greater partnership. So we have a really clear-eyed commitment to collaborate on shared priorities over the next decade, driving growth through that comprehensive trade deal, nurturing the next generation of global talent, and seizing the opportunities, but also having a conversation about the world as it is, not the world that we want it to be. So just to conclude, before I take the excellent challenging questions I'm sure I'm going to get from the moderator and from all of you, in a fragmented world, I think the UK-India partnership is becoming one of the real potential stabilizers of the international system. The world today requires that kind of revitalized, really pragmatic, really agile multilateralism that draws strength from long-standing institutions and alliances, but is also flexible enough to reform, to adapt, to change, and to build new partnerships. We don't believe that a retreat into isolationism will help us or anybody else. We believe that only through international cooperation and joint action can we succeed, and indeed can the world succeed to the benefit of all of its people. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Excellency, for laying out both UK's priorities and as far as the larger geopolitics is concerned and how it is evolving, but also India, UK, and the ambition that you have set out. I like that the optimism that I think with which you concluded, because I think at times there is so much despondency around. Everyone is, we are complaining all the time as to what is happening to the world. But I think in that despondency, we miss out that there are certain areas which are very forward-looking. There is an opportunity to, in fact, to construct an entire order without relying on some of the more complicated or challenges that I think the world order has faced for a long time. So in the sense, what we are looking at in this conversation, and I'll open this up in a few minutes for the audience to come. And as you can see, it's a full house. So there is, I'm assuming they have all come with their questions prepared for you. But I think in some ways, situating UK's foreign policy in today's context, if you can give us a sense of how do you envision the transatlantic relationship evolving? Because that seems to me at this point at a very febrile, sort of a moment in that relationship. And given that the transatlantic relationship, in fact, has been the guarantor of the liberal international order, do you see a direct relationship between what is happening to this alliance and to what is happening to the liberal international order?
So, the US has been our longest-standing, most important security partner and still is. And indeed, President Trump himself, I think, has said in one of his many visits to the UK, which I would remind you went remarkably well, and I have to say he has huge affection, I think, in particular for His Majesty the King, and indeed actually previously for Her Majesty the Queen. The US and UK have a very special relationship, like no other, passed down through the centuries. And I think for us, this is a long-term thing. This is not a short thing. It is something where we are deeply embedded with each other's systems. I've personally seen that, I think, in almost every role I have ever been in, whether that's standing alongside US counterparts or whether that is working on challenges together. It remains an incredibly important relationship. But that doesn't mean we can't be honest with our friends when we disagree with them. I think what we've seen in the last couple of days, where we have said very clearly what our perspective is, in particular in Greenland, is us respectfully disagreeing. And I think being clear that we have a slightly different perspective, but also I think being clear along with our many NATO partners how much we value the wider alliances that the US is part of. And I think that's something we value very highly. It's something extremely important, not least, I think, for the high Arctic and for the North Atlantic. And we are really committed to NATO and indeed actually to international laws and principle of the system. But as I say, I'm particularly lucky because I feel I have a Prime Minister who is in many ways perfectly suited for these times. He is calm, he is pragmatic, he takes the world as he sees it, not the world as he would wish it to be, but he also very deeply understands the legal principles that behind that. So I think we're at a moment when the world is more volatile. There are more interesting challenges and different ones, but I think there are still some cornerstones that we see in the middle of that.
So, if I can just push this on Greenland, there are substantive differences between Europe, EU, and the US, and there has been a back and forth. We saw that in Davos in the last 48 hours, and in that context, how optimistic you are that the framework of an agreement that we are being told is on the tables will be the way forward, or do you see a disruption coming our way or the world's way?
So I think it would be, given that things change moment to moment in Davos and we're quite a long way away, it would be a fool's errand to give a running commentary, I think, basically. But I think that we're really clear at the fundamental heart of this that the future of Greenland belongs to the people of Greenland and indeed to the people of the Kingdom of Denmark, and that's for them to choose. So, but I think you've seen a sort of evolution over the last couple of days, and I think that many voices have been heard, and that's been a good thing.
And if it comes to, as many European nations, EU nations have said that they would want to push back, if it comes to that, through the use of what is called a straight bazooka or other such measures, how would UK respond to that? Because this is a trade war between US and EU is also a global issue, because it would put us all in a very difficult position, given that the global economy is already in a difficult spot. So, what would be UK's response to that conversation, where the two sides come head to head on certain trade retaliatory measures?
So I'm not going to speculate on sort of hypothetical scenarios, but I think we have been really clear that we think that the use of tariffs as a threat to allies is inappropriate, and that we don't think that should be the case. So that's been a very clear position, particularly in the last couple of days.
Excellency, on the one side, there is the US, and on the other, of course, we have had a long-standing, and you mentioned in your remarks about China and how the opportunity that China showcases for the rest of the world is also a challenge in some ways, because national security and economic growth have been interlinked now for the last few years. You, in your remarks, made a distinction that, look, the economic opportunity that China provides is something that countries and nations should be optimistic. And India has also taken a similar position. But there is an inherent national security challenge that it has, because if that integration leads to supply chain issues, if it leads to weaponization of trade dependencies, then there has to be a response. How is UK tackling this problem?
So it's a really good question. So in my previous role, I was the CEO of the National Cybersecurity Centre. So I was deeply embedded in some of the discussions in our system about how we handle some of those challenges. And I think in particular, one of the things I would flag is that when any economy becomes so dominant in global supply chains, I think we face challenges. Not necessarily because there is an intentional threat, but actually because unintentionally, we may have left ourselves more exposed to decisions by an individual company, let alone by a country. And I think in many ways, the case you saw that most clearly in was the case of Huawei and the telecom supply chain, where as a result of being a very effective low-cost supplier, Huawei had become incredibly dominant in part of the supply chain with only a couple of much smaller European competitors, to the point that actually, in many ways, as in fact one African Minister of Telecoms put it to me, if we buy the best value for money solution, we have no choice but to buy Huawei. And I think we felt very uncomfortable with the position that, frankly, we were left in a situation where there was no choice. So we have, over the years, I think, taken a slightly more assertive approach to our own economic security with some of the legislation that we've passed that allows for example, more scrutiny of investments that have a national security implication, again, whether intentional or not. And sometimes this is a preventative long-term approach where we're simply looking to ensure that we have choice. It's actually a very similar approach to India's approach. And I think in many ways we're very lucky because India, as a rising global economy itself, in my view, will offer many of the choices that avoid that dependency on a single economy. You see it also quite clearly in some of the green tech sectors, I think, again, where actually the risk is there are single suppliers or small numbers of suppliers. And we saw that particularly clearly during COVID, where we all saw our vulnerability to supply chains, where, again, unintentionally, perhaps we might have become dependent on one or two suppliers when the world closed down and when options were no longer available. So I think that for all countries now, taking a really clear-eyed approach to the possibility of future change. And I think, again, last year has taught us that more than anything else, the economy can change radically. But also just understanding where we have dependencies allows us to understand that and act on it. And again, I think in India, you see the really clear intent to make India more autonomous, make India less dependent on others, self-reliant India. And I think that's a very understandable strategy in the global situation. But it's also a strategy that I think is hugely beneficial for the world. Because again, India as a supplier, as much as a consumer, is actually a sort of price maker, not a price taker in a sense. It has the agency to be able to affect the world as the sort of fifth largest economy, soon to be sort of fourth or third, in a way that means that I think it will drive these changes as much as take them. And I think that's why we pay so much attention to choices in the Indian system. It's also why we want our economy to be much more integrated with India, and why we were keen to set some of the amazing precedents we set in the trade deal that allowed that level of openness. I think it's something like, 99% of tariff lines on one side and 90% on the other side that have now been zeroed out in a way that means that actually we really have the chance to build that. And what we've already seen from that trade deal is actually an uptick in UK-India trade as a result. We've already seen significant increased interest from businesses looking both ways, because actually businesses see the opportunity to work in both economies, but also to see that as a platform for the world. I mean, take Revolut as an example, which in many ways came to India, not just to service actually the UK and the Indian market, but actually to service a global market as well. And I think that's a huge opportunity that we want to see more of, particularly given our amazing people-to-people links as well.
You started off your remarks with the Russia-Ukraine war and how that is being played out. You said a deal is on the table. Where do you see this going? I mean, again, it's relatively speculative, but I think the challenge it poses in the way that perhaps there was an expectation last year that we are reaching, in some ways, the conclusion of one way or another.
Yeah.
But we have seen an escalation in violence. We have seen how this conflict has escalated instead of the two sides climbing down.
Yeah.
How do you assess the likelihood that the deal would survive, or do you think that there is still more conflict on the way before anything concrete happens? There is a lot of Trump effect in the way the situation has evolved, but beyond Mr. Trump, do you envision this? How do you envision this unfold? And one, I think, related issue here is eventually, how do you see a European relationship with Russia evolve? Because that's a question about European security architecture. What kind of a security architecture you envision that might be sustainable, given the challenges that architecture is facing at the moment?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure it's one I have a great answer to be perfectly honest, in terms of the sustainable long-term architecture, because I think in many ways the urgent issue is actually to bring the current conflict to an end. Like, the current conflict is absolutely in the way of having that very sensible debate around what a wider European security architecture that meets the needs of all of the countries on the continent actually looks like. And of course, I'm a child of the end of the Cold War, and I left school literally the year that the Cold War ended. And I'm slightly alarmed to count up and realise that in fact it has almost as long since the Cold War ended as it actually lasted, which is a bit alarming and makes me feel slightly old. But I think the point is, in many ways, you go back to the history in this continent. We have very, very fond memories of Russia's role, for example, in the Second World War, the extraordinary role that the Red Army played in liberating Europe, the millions of Russians that suffered and died. So, this is not about Russia. This is in many ways about Putin's decision to start an illegal war. And I think it has been an illegal war that has lasted for 4 years. This is now longer than Russia fought in the Second World War. The suffering of the Ukrainian people has been extraordinary, and if Russia stopped fighting now, the war would stop. So I think what we need to do is see that ceasefire, see the conflict brought to a conclusion, have the killing end, and really seriously engage with how it is we can have peace in this conflict. It's incredibly hard to predict. I remember very clearly when the war started, and in fact, I remember how much many of our European colleagues really didn't believe this was going to happen. We, as the UK, and indeed our US colleagues also, I think were deeply alarmed, but very clear that we saw the prospect of this happening. Other European colleagues were convinced it could never happen because it was so unthinkable. And I think sometimes here in India, it is important to understand what a huge issue this has been for the whole European continent. This has upended the notions of European security. It has made us face the prospect of war on the European continent for really the first time, since the Second World War, first time in my lifetime. And it is a horrible thing to behold, and it has been the cause of huge pain and suffering. We saw that with the many thousands of refugees that the UK has taken, that other European countries have taken, families have opened their doors to because of that suffering. So I think the first thing we just need to see is that frankly a ceasefire holds, peace arrives, and then we're able to have that longer term conversation about how it is that security can work for everybody. But I think it can't happen until then because this is such an obstacle.
Excellency, if we can just, I'll just raise one question on India, UK now before I open this up for people to ask you directly. We have had a tremendous year, as you highlighted last year, which was very productive, and I think in some ways the challenge in India-UK relationship has been we tended to look backwards more than forwards, and I think this idea that history is important, but it should not determine the future of the relationship. And I think we have crossed that threshold, and in some ways, increasingly we talk about forward-looking agenda, whether it's technology, trade, education, mobility, all of those. But there are those challenges which still are beneath the surface. And I think, as you said, it is important to have an honest conversation, whether it's on immigration, whether it is on extremism that is there. How effective you have seen the institutional mechanisms that we have created, how effective have they been in sort of having that honest conversation that you talk about? Because are we tackling those issues away from the glamour and glitz of the successes that we have achieved?
Absolutely, because I think that one of the fundamental principles in the UK-India relationship is that we have honest conversations in private. We don't lecture each other in the newspapers. That's not a helpful way, I think, for any country to behave to each other, but actually it's particularly unhelpful given some of the history that we have. And I think we're hugely respectful of that. I'm lucky because I grew up in Northern Ireland, and therefore I grew up in a country where history weighs heavily. There are many, many better poets that express that than I can. But therefore, there is always a risk if you continue looking to the history that actually you never reach the present and you really don't reach the future. So for me, it's been incredibly important to be very respectful of that history, but nevertheless not to be bound by it, and actually not to have it limit the potential of the future. Because we have an extraordinary relationship. There are almost 2 million people in the UK of Indian heritage who are an absolutely fundamental part of our vibrant multicultural society. Practically every Indian I meet in Delhi is off to London for the summer, and if not to London, to Scotland or Northern Ireland. I think I've never been in a country where Northern Ireland was such an attractive tourist destination because it's green and slightly damp in May and June, which I have to say I'm delighted about, and shamelessly promoting as much as I can. I would do the Game of Thrones tour, the Titanic Museum, and then go to the Giant's Causeway if I were you. But seriously, we see those. Indian tourists go way beyond London. They're not coming to London for the first time. They're building on incredibly deep links. They're building on families that often have children at university or at school. They're building on people who have gone to work and come back again over many generations. And so it is an extraordinarily deep relationship, but I think it is one that has extraordinary potential because we also have, in many ways, that shared language. We have a shared appreciation of business. We have a shared, frankly, level of entrepreneurialism, I think, and innovation. We really share some brilliant universities where I think there is huge potential to make more of some of the very best brains in the UK and India to create together some of the most exciting innovations in the world, but also turn that into some of the most exciting economic opportunities. So I think I'm incredibly excited about what we can do together, but I want to be also incredibly practical about making sure that we keep on driving that through. And I think therefore there are some short-term things we can do on things like education. I was delighted when we had the 9 universities in Mumbai with the Prime Minister. I got a whole series of phone calls to the British Council afterwards saying, why weren't we invited? And we said, well, if you'd like to set up a campus in India, we would be delighted to invite you next time round. So I think there is huge potential on education, on growth, on tech, but also to tackle global changes like climate. But absolutely, having that level of trust and that level of respect for each other, that level of recognition that there are things that sometimes we don't always agree on, but we have those conversations privately and more than once. It's not a one-off and then we go away. It's a repeat game where we keep on nudging away to think, is there a better way we can deal with this? Do we really understand what you're worried about? Have we taken that seriously enough? Have we done something about that? And have we proved to you that we've addressed that? And I think that sort of repeat interaction where, our prime ministers have now met multiple times and for long periods of time, then allows us to have those deeper conversations in private, rather than in public, on the relatively few things on which either we see the world in a different way, or where there are small tensions in our relationship that we want to try and resolve. And again, I am very much of the school of, take the world as you find it. And my view is these are not things to be observed and worried about. They are things to be fixed and moved on from. And that's what I think we need to do in this relationship, to take the massive opportunity. And it really is. I mean, I'm sort of excited about everybody else's trade deals, but I'm really excited about our trade deal because this is the year it will come into force. And we'll get to not just take advantage of the hypothetical benefits or indeed the anticipation, and businesses are already investing. We'll actually get to see the genuine uptake. I believe that by the time of the next election, the difference that the UK-India trade deal has made to the UK and Indian economies will be palpable and will be noticed in both of those elections. And I think will be to the credit of both leaders who had the far-sighted view of wanting to, frankly, not let the little things, and trade deals are a great example of this. Every time I hear people saying we've got X chapters done, we've just got a few to go, I think, yes, but the last ones are always the hardest. And so actually, trade deals are a way you have to work through some of the little challenges to get to the big benefits. And that's what we were able to do in the deal. And that's why, whiskey will cost you half the price from sometime this year that it did last year, and why we're very excited about Scottish salmon and about British cars and all of the other opportunities that we get. And I get asked about it all the time, which is amazing.
Excellency, thank you so much. And this has been wonderful to hear from you, your views on a range of issues. And in a sign of how times have changed and how we are talking about forward-looking, there was no question on Pakistan. There was a slight mention of Kashmir. Otherwise, in any other setup, you would have, a few years back, they would have dominated. But I think this is the state of India-UK relationship. Very positive, very forward-looking. So more power to you and your colleagues in making this happen. And we hope that this relationship continues to grow the way it has in the last few years. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon.